The air in the royal eyrie stank of burnt rock, impatient dragon, and desperate perfume. Ruby didn't belong there. She knew it. The guards knew it. And the massive Crimson War dragon definitely knew it. Her job was simple. Fix the loose cinch buckle on the Alpha King's ceremonial saddle, then disappear before the choosing began. Just another shadow. Another pair of invisible hands. But when the buckle pins slipped and blood welled on her lip, Scald smelled it. He turned his molten gold eyes straight to her hiding place. And in that instant, everything changed. Scald had chosen his rider. Let's begin. The air in the royal eyrie stank of three things: burnt rock, impatient dragon, and desperate perfume. Ruby didn't belong there. She knew it with the same certainty she knew the exact number of steps between the lower hay stores and the water trough, 43. The guards at the base of the volcanic stairway knew it too. They had sneered at her patched leather tunic and the bucket of grease swinging from her calloused hand, only letting her pass because they recognized the sigil of the head groom burned into her wooden pass stick. And from the way the massive crimson beast on the platform was snorting embers at the line of noble ladies, the war dragon definitely knew it. Ruby's life in the royal keep was governed by simple, unbreakable rules. Scrub the limestone floors of the lower stables until they gleamed like wet bone, polish the brass fittings on the spare harnesses until she could see her own tired reflection, and above all else, stay out of sight. She was the shadow that kept the gears turning, the unseen hand that ensured the great war machine of the kingdom didn't grind to a halt due to a rusty buckle or a loose scale. But fate, as it often does, wore the face of an overworked superior. Cicely, the head groom, had grabbed her by the scruff of her tunic an hour before the sun reached its zenith. Ernest is down with the sweating sickness, Cicely had rasped, her hands rough as pumice and twice as dry. She shoved a heavy iron pin and a mallet into Ruby's chest. And Madeline slipped on the wet stone near the sluice gates this morning and twisted her ankle something fierce. You're the only one left with hands small enough to reset the main cinch buckle on the Alpha's ceremonial saddle without pinching the grain of the leather. Get up there, fix it, and get out before they start the choosing. You hear me? Before, do not let Aldous see you. The Chamberlain hates anything that breathes air he thinks belongs to him. Ruby had nodded mutely. She was good at nodding. She was good at fixing things. She was not good at being invisible when the entire court was gathered. She had snuck onto the high platform using the groom's tunnel, a claustrophobic shaft of volcanic rock that opened behind the massive obsidian pillar nearest the dragon's tail. The saddle was a masterpiece of intimidation. Black leather burnished to a dark cherry sheen, studded with iron rivets shaped like snarling wolf heads. And there, right on the girth strap, was the problem. The main cinch buckle was canted at an angle that would cause the entire saddle to slip sideways the moment any real weight was put in the stirrup. It was a death trap disguised as a throne. Ruby had fixed it. Her small, grease-stained fingers had worked the iron pin free, reseated the leather tongue, and hammered the pin home with 3 silent, precise taps of her mallet. The leather lay flat and true now. She had wiped a smudge of ash from the pommel with her sleeve and turned to leave. She was about to go. She really was. But then the candidates arrived, and she got trapped. The tunnel entrance had swung shut automatically on a weighted rope hinge. To open it again, she'd have to step out into the open, right in front of the entire assembled nobility of the 5 valleys and the simmering glare of a 2-ton apex predator. So she stayed put, pressing her spine against the cool, smooth obsidian, praying to the old gods of stone and fire that she would simply cease to exist for the next hour. Alpha King Connor stood on the far side of the platform, his silhouette a dark cutout against the blazing blue sky. His arms were crossed over his broad chest, the leather of his vambraces creaking softly with the tension in his forearms. He wasn't even watching the women. He was staring at the horizon with the tired, simmering frustration of a man who had been forced to participate in his own parade. His jaw was set like a bear trap, and a muscle twitched high on his cheekbone every time Aldous, the royal chamberlain, cleared his throat. Every eligible Luna from the 5 allied territories was here, a bouquet of silk and jewels, each one flanked by a handler whispering last-minute coaching. They looked like exotic birds that had been scrubbed, polished, and released into a cage with a very hungry cat. The key is confidence, Lady Giselle, Aldous was saying, his voice oily and smooth like butter left too long in the sun. He hovered near a blonde woman whose smile looked like it had been carved from marble, beautiful but utterly immovable. The beast smells fear, but more importantly, the beast smells intent. You must project that you already own the saddle. You must believe it is your birthright. Do not ask permission to mount. Take it. Giselle, daughter of the northern Lord Varen, stepped forward. She was beautiful in the way a polished executioner's sword is beautiful, deadly, cold, and wielded by a man who would sell his own mother for a favorable trade route. Her gown was the color of fresh spilled wine, and it rustled like snakeskin as she moved. She placed her manicured hand on the red scales of Scald's flank, right above his massive shoulder. Nothing happened. The crowd, gathered on the lower viewing terraces, let out a collective sigh of relief that sounded like wind through dry grass. Encouraged by the lack of immediate incineration, Giselle allowed a tiny smirk to grace her lips. She swung a leg up toward the mounting stirrup. It was an elegant move, practiced for weeks in her father's courtyard on a wooden mock-up of the beast. Thwump! Scald's wings snapped open like a leather mainsail catching a gale. It caught Giselle square in the sternum with the force of a battering ram. She didn't just fall, she flew. She sailed backward 5 feet and landed in a heap of expensive silk, tangled underskirts, and wounded pride right at the feet of her horrified younger sister. The dragon let out a sound that was unmistakably a scoff, a burst of hot, sulphurous air that smelled of roasted mutton and disdain. "She is not the one," Connor said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the platform and echoed off the cavern walls. He didn't even turn around. He just uncrossed his arms long enough to wave a dismissive hand. "Next!" Giselle was hauled to her feet by 2 flustered attendants, her marble smile now cracked with a fury that promised political repercussions for years to come. One by one they tried. And one by one, Scald dismissed them, Ernest's daughter, allowed a special dispensation despite her father's illness, attempted a soothing song passed down from the ancient dragon whispers. Scald yawned wide enough to show rows of teeth that looked like ivory daggers and snapped his jaws shut a mere inch from her fluttering fan. She fainted and had to be carried off by the guards. Madeline's replacement, a cousin hastily dressed in a borrowed gown, limped up bravely with a handful of honeyed oats. She held them out like a peace offering. Scald flicked the very tip of his spiked tail, a casual, almost bored movement, and sent the bucket of oats clattering over the edge of the platform into the misty abyss below the eyrie. The clatter of the bucket faded into silence, a perfect metaphor for her chances. Aldous was sweating. It was a rare and unpleasant sight. The chamberlain's bald pate gleamed with moisture under the volcanic sun, and his pristine white collar was beginning to wilt. He clutched his ceremonial staff as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Alpha King," Aldous hissed, leaning close to Connor's shoulder. "The treaties require a Luna. The Council of 5 is watching. If the War Dragon rejects every candidate, it is a sign of divine disfavor. The Northern Lord is already muttering about alternative arrangements. We must have a queen." "The dragon insists more," Connor replied, his voice tight as a bowstring. He finally turned his head, his eyes, the same molten gold as the beast's, a trait of the royal bloodline boring into Aldous. "Scald has carried me through 3 wars. He's the only reason the Frost clans haven't turned the Southern Valley into a graveyard and salted the earth with our children's bones. He is my bondmate. If he says no, I say no. I will not strap a woman to his back that he intends to throw into the clouds." The final candidate stood shivering in the center of the platform. It was Giselle's younger sister, a wisp of a girl in an emerald dress whose name Ruby couldn't remember. She was shaking so hard the tiny emeralds sewn into her hair rattled like the sound of falling hail. "Mount," Aldous commanded, his voice cracking with desperation. The girl took 2 wobbling steps towards Scald. Scald roared. It wasn't a fire roar, thank the stars and the small mercies of the deep earth, but it was a sound that vibrated in Ruby's bones behind the pillar. The force of it rippled the girl's gown, ruffled her carefully arranged hair, and sent her scurrying back with a shriek of pure, primal terror. She tripped over the hem of her dress, scrambled up, and fled sobbing into the arms of her attendants. The platform was silent except for the endless wind whipping up from the valley floor. A royal failure. A kingdom without a queen. The scent of political ruin was thicker than the sulfur, and that's when it happened. Ruby had been holding the heavy iron buckle pin, the spare she'd taken from her tool pouch just in case, in her teeth while she'd been waiting. It was a nervous habit, something to occupy her mouth so she wouldn't grind her teeth. The roar startled her so badly that she bit down hard. The pin slipped, its edge scraping across her lower lip and slicing a thin, stinging cut. She tasted copper. Sharp and hot, she let out a tiny, involuntary hiss of pain. Oh, it was barely a whisper. It shouldn't have been audible over the wind, over the echoes of the roar, over the pounding of blood in everyone's ears. But the acoustics of the volcanic cavern were strange. The obsidian pillars caught and funneled sound in odd ways. Scald's head snapped around. The massive dragon turned its long, serpentine neck with a speed that belied its immense size. The plates of armor along its spine scraped together with a sound like two swords being sharpened against each other. It fixed its molten gold gaze directly on the pillar where Ruby was hiding. She froze. She could feel the heat of his stare through the stone. It was like standing next to a smithy's forge after the bellows had been pumping for an hour. Her blood turned to ice water even as her skin prickled with heat. Every noble, every guard, every servant on the terraces below followed the dragon's line of sight. The whispers started like a brush fire, fast and crackling. Who is behind that column? Connor's voice cut through the murmuring. He had turned fully now, his posture shifting from bored frustration to coiled alertness. His hand drifted toward the sword at his hip. Aldous squinted, his face pinched with confusion and annoyance. "It's just the scrub girl, Your Majesty, the one Cicely sent to fix the buckle on the ceremonial saddle. A groom, barely more than a drudge, nothing to concern." Crunch, crunch, crunch. Scald began to walk, not toward the nobles, not toward the exit tunnel. He walked toward the pillar. The platform shook with each deliberate step of his talons, curved black sickles of horn that scored the volcanic stone as if it were soft cheese. The vibration traveled up through Ruby's worn leather boots and rattled her teeth. Connor's hand closed around the hilt of his sword. Not because he feared the dragon would hurt the girl, but because he had never, in 12 years of bond mating, seen Scald exhibit this behavior toward anyone but himself. The war dragon didn't approach people. People approached him, and they usually regretted it. Ruby pressed her back against the obsidian pillar so hard she could feel the rough texture of the stone through her tunic, the tiny volcanic glass crystals biting into her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her lips moved in a silent, desperate litany. "I'm invisible. I'm just a shadow. I'm a piece of furniture. I'm the grease on the axle. No one sees me. No one sees me. No one." Hot air washed over her face. It smelled of charcoal, brimstone, and something else. Something strangely clean, like rain on hot rock. Ruby opened her eyes. Scald's snout had come around the side of the pillar. It was so close she could see the individual cracks in the black scales around his nostrils, the way the edges were worn smooth from a century of breathing fire and stone dust. The hot air of his breath dried the nervous sweat on her face and made the thin cut on her lip sting. His eye, a great molten pool of gold with a vertical slit pupil that could widen to take in the darkness of a storm cloud or narrow to a hair's breadth to track a diving hawk, was fixed on her. Not with aggression, not with curiosity, with recognition. Then the dragon did something unprecedented. Something that made Aldous drop his staff with a clatter and made Cicely, who had crept up the lower stairs to see what the commotion was about, gasp and clutch her chest. Scald lowered his enormous head and nudged Ruby's shoulder. Gently, the way a warhorse might nudge the stable hand who always brought him an extra apple, or the way a massive, scarred tomcat might butt its head against the leg of the one person who knew exactly where to scratch behind its ear. Ruby's knees buckled. She would have fallen if the dragon's snout hadn't been there, propping her up. The scales were surprisingly warm and smooth against her cheek. "Mount him." Connor's voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence of the crowd like a blade through silk. He was striding across the platform now, his heavy boots echoing in the cavernous space. He stopped just on the other side of the dragon's neck, his golden eyes locked on the grimy, trembling girl who was currently being nuzzled by the most dangerous creature in the 5 valleys. What?" Ruby stammered, her bloody lip trembling so hard the word came out in 3 pieces. She looked from the dragon's eye to the Alpha King's face and felt her stomach drop into the volcanic abyss below. "I'm not a candidate, I'm not. I'm just here for the buckle. I fixed the buckle, it's fixed. See." She pointed weakly at the cinch strap. Her hand was shaking. Scald huffed again, a warm gust of breath that smelled like the heart of a forge. He shifted his weight, the massive muscles of his shoulder bunching and relaxing under the ruby-red scales. He presented his flank, turning slightly so that the very saddle she had just repaired, with the cinch buckle lying flat and perfect and true, was right in front of her face. The stirrup hung there, waiting. Connor strode the last few steps, coming to stand so close she could see the fine scars that traced his jawline like a map of old battles. The way the gold of his eyes was ringed with a thin line of darker amber. He looked at Ruby, really looked at her. He saw the ash smudged on her cheek like a warrior's war paint. He saw the worn leather of her fingerless gloves, stained with grease and hard work. He saw the terrified certainty in her eyes, the look of a mouse that has just realized the cat is not only not going to eat it, but is asking it to dance. And then he looked at the dragon waiting beside her with the patience of stone. "He is a war dragon," Connor said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. The commanding bark was gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "In 12 years, I have never seen him lower his head to anyone but me. He has thrown every lady of noble blood in the 5 valleys. He has rejected perfumed hair and silk gowns and political pedigrees that stretch back 300 years. He has been waiting, Ruby who fixes buckles." He reached out, and for a terrifying moment, Ruby thought he was going to grab her and throw her onto the saddle himself. Instead, he took the edge of his sleeve, and with a surprisingly gentle motion, wiped the smear of blood from her cut lip. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender that Ruby forgot how to breathe. "For a queen," Connor continued, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her ears and the dragon's keen hearing. "For the woman he has already chosen to carry." Implication hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Ruby's knees were water. Her heart was a war drum. Her mind was a screaming void of pure, unadulterated panic. But the dragon nudged her again, impatient. A low rumble started deep in his chest, not a growl of warning, but a sound that vibrated up through her bones and made her teeth hum. A purr. A massive, tectonic purr that made the whole volcanic platform feel like it was humming a lullaby, swallowing the metallic taste of blood and fear in her mouth. Ruby reached up with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her grease-stained fingers closed around the cold iron of the pommel on the Alpha King's saddle. The leather was warm from the dragon's body heat. The wolf head rivets seemed to gleam at her, not with menace, but with invitation. She put her foot in the stirrup. Scald did not move to throw her. He lowered his shoulders slightly, like a gentleman offering a lady his arm to step up into a carriage. His purring intensified, a deep, resonant thrum that made the pebbles on the platform dance. And behind them, unnoticed by the gaping nobility and the slack-jawed chamberlain, Cicely, the old head groom with hands like pumice and a heart that remembered the old prophecies whispered in the stables late at night, smiled a secret, knowing smile. Because she'd always known that limestone floors and brass polish were no place for a girl with hands steady enough to fix a war king's buckles, and a spirit quiet enough to be heard by a dragon's heart. Ruby's foot slipped off the stirrup the first time. Her hands were slick with cold sweat despite the volcanic heat radiating from Scald's scales. The second time, she gripped the pommel so hard the wolf head rivets bit into her palm and pulled. She swung up into the saddle like a sack of grain, ungraceful, awkward, and utterly without the elegant poise of the noblewomen who had failed before her. Her worn leather boots found the stirrups. Her thighs settled against the warm, smooth leather. The saddle she had repaired held perfectly. The world went silent. Scald's purring stopped. The wind seemed to pause. Even the ever-present rumble of the volcano beneath their feet quieted, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. And then Scald moved. He didn't launch into the sky. He didn't throw her. He simply shifted his weight, testing the feel of her in the saddle, the way a dancer tests a new partner. His massive head turned, that molten gold eye fixing on her face. Ruby felt something brush against the edges of her mind. Not words, not thoughts, but a feeling. Warm, curious, approving. Connor stood frozen, his hand still raised from where he had wiped the blood from her lip. His golden eyes were wide, the mask of the bored, frustrated king completely shattered. He looked like a man who had spent 12 years thinking he understood the rules of the world, only to watch those rules be rewritten by a trembling, stable girl with a cut lip. Aldous found his voice first. It was a strangled, outraged squawk. "This is preposterous." The chamberlain snatched his fallen staff from the ground and pointed it at Ruby as if she were a rat that had wandered onto the dinner table. "She is a groom. She has no bloodline, no title." "No," Scald disagrees. Connor's voice was quiet, but it cut through Aldous' protests like a hot knife through tallow. The Alpha King walked slowly toward the dragon's shoulder, his eyes never leaving Ruby's face. She sat rigid in the saddle, her knuckles white on the pommel, looking like a sparrow that had accidentally landed on an eagle's perch. "What is your name?" Connor asked. "Your full name." "Ruby." Her voice came out as a croak. She swallowed hard, tasting copper and ash. "Just Ruby, I don't have a house name. I was found near the southern sluice gates as a baby. Cicely raised me in the stables." Foundling. Aldous spat the word like a curse. "Alpha King, I beg you." The Council of Five will never accept a gutter orphan as Luna. The Northern Lord will declare it an insult. Lady Giselle's father will. Lady Giselle's father, Connor interrupted, turning to face his chamberlain with a cold, dangerous calm, sent his daughter here dressed in wine-red silk and armed with nothing but arrogance. My dragon threw her on her backside in front of the entire court. If Lord Varen wishes to declare war because his daughter cannot sit a saddle, let him. I have Scald. And now, it seems, Scald has her. He gestured toward Ruby without looking at her. "Choosing is over," Connor announced, his voice rising to carry across the terraces where the nobility still gaped in stunned silence. "The war dragon has made his selection. Ruby of the royal stables will be given chambers in the airy tower. She will be fitted for proper attire, and she will begin instruction as a Luna candidate immediately." Ruby's stomach dropped. Luna candidate. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, like a foreign language shouted in a crowded market. "I can't," she whispered. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Your Majesty, I can't. I don't know how to be a lady. I don't know how to dance or curtsy or speak in the high tongue. I know how to mend leather and measure grain and clean limestone. That's all, that's all." Connor looked up at her. For a long, breathless moment, he simply studied her face. The ash on her cheek, the terror in her eyes, the way her hands gripped the saddle like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned to water. "Scald doesn't care about dancing," he said finally. "And neither do I." He reached up and placed his hand over hers on the pommel. His palm was warm and rough with calluses of his own, sword calluses, not laborer's calluses, but calluses nonetheless. A warrior's hands, a king's hands. "Dragon chose you," he said softly, so only she could hear. "That means something. I don't know what yet, but I intend to find out." Scald shifted beneath her, and Ruby felt that strange brush against her mind again. Warmer this time, stronger. It felt like standing next to a hearth fire on a cold winter night. It felt like coming home to a place she had never been. Cicely appeared at the edge of the platform, her weathered face unreadable. She bowed stiffly to Connor, then looked up at Ruby with eyes that held 100 unspoken things. "Come on then, girl," Cicely said, her rough voice gentle. "Let's get you down from there. You've got a long road ahead, and it don't start on the back of a dragon. It starts with a bath and a proper meal." Ruby looked down at the old groom who had raised her from nothing, then at the Alpha King who looked at her like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve, and finally at the massive crimson dragon who had chosen her for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. She swung her leg over the saddle and slid down Scald's warm flank. Her boots hit the stone platform. The world felt different now, sharper, louder, more dangerous. She was no longer invisible. Every eye in the area was fixed on her. Scald lowered his great head one more time and exhaled a warm, sulphurous breath over her hair. A blessing, a brand, a promise, as Cicely led her away toward the servants' stairs, because apparently she was to use the main stairs now, and wouldn't that be a thing to get used to? Ruby looked back over her shoulder. Connor was still standing beside Scald, one hand resting on the dragon's neck. He was watching her go with an expression she couldn't read. But behind him, half hidden in the shadows of the volcanic cavern, Aldous was watching too, and the Chamberlain's eyes held nothing but cold, calculating fury. The airy tower smelled wrong. Ruby stood in the center of a circular chamber 3 times the size of the entire stable dormitory, her wet hair dripping onto a rug that probably cost more than a year's supply of grain. The bath had been an ordeal. Attendants had descended upon her like crows on carrion, scrubbing away years of stable grime with rose-scented soap and rough cloths. They had clucked over the calluses on her palms and the scars on her knees from years of kneeling on stone floors. Now she wore a simple gray gown. It was the plainest thing in the wardrobe they had shown her, and it still felt like wearing a cloud. She kept expecting it to snag on a loose nail. There were no loose nails here. Cicely said from the doorway. The old groom had refused to leave Ruby's side, batting away the fine ladies who had been assigned as her new attendants. "You look almost human." Feel like a horse dressed up for a parade, Ruby muttered, tugging at the unfamiliar neckline. This is wrong, Cicely, all of this. I should be mucking out the lower stalls right now. Ernest's replacement doesn't know to watch for Scald's left talon. He favors it when he sleeps. If the bedding isn't piled right, he gets stiff. Cicely's weathered face softened. She crossed the room and took Ruby's hands in her own rough, familiar grip. Listen to me, girl. I found you 15 years ago, wrapped in a grain sack near the sluice gates. You were small as a skinned rabbit and twice as quiet. I thought you'd be dead by morning. Her grip tightened. You survived. You thrived. You learned every corner of those stables, and you did it without complaining, without asking for more than you were given. I was happy, Ruby whispered. I was. You were safe. There's a difference. Cicely released her hands and stepped back. The dragon chose you. I don't know why, and I don't pretend to understand the minds of those great beasts, but Scald doesn't make mistakes. He didn't choose Lady Giselle with her perfect bloodline and her father's armies. He chose the girl who fixed his saddle. A knock at the door made them both turn. Ernest, pale and still recovering from the sweating sickness but determined to see for himself, poked his head in. His eyes widened when he saw Ruby in the gray gown. Stars above, he wheezed. It's true, the whole keep is buzzing like a kicked hive. They're saying you sat Scald like you were born to it. Sat him like a sack of potatoes, Ruby corrected. Ernest grinned weakly. Sacks of potatoes don't usually survive contact with that beast. Lady Giselle is demanding her father send riders. Madeline's cousin is claiming the dragon was bewitched. And Aldous. His grin faded. Aldous is in the council chamber with the Alpha King right now, Ernest continued, lowering his voice. I passed by on my way here. The Chamberlain is arguing that the choosing must be declared invalid. He says a groom cannot be Luna. He's invoking old laws, bloodline decrees, even suggesting a retrial by combat. Ruby's blood chilled. What did the king say? Nothing yet. He was just standing there, listening. His face was like stone. Ernest hesitated. But Lady Giselle was there too. She's offered a compromise. What compromise? Cicely demanded. Ernest looked at Ruby with something like pity. She says if the groom can prove she truly has the dragon's favor, she should demonstrate it. In public, at the Festival of Flames. Festival of Flames. Ruby knew it well. Every year on the longest night of summer, the kingdom celebrated the bond between the Alpha King and Scald. There was feasting, music, and a ceremonial flight where the king and dragon soared over the 5 valleys while the people cheered. Demonstrate it how? Ruby asked, though she already knew the answer. They want you to fly him, Ernest said quietly. In front of everyone, without the king. Room fell silent. Cicely's face went pale beneath her weathered tan, flying Scald. Alone, without Connor's bond to guide him, without the Alpha's commands. It was suicide dressed up as a test. Even the most experienced dragon riders spent years building trust before attempting a solo flight. Ruby had sat in a saddle exactly once for less than 5 minutes while the beast stood still. She can't, Cicely said flatly. She's never flown. She doesn't know the commands. Scald might tolerate her on the ground, but in the air, without Connor. He'll throw her into the clouds and let her fall. That's what they're counting on, Ernest said. Ruby walked to the tower window and looked out. Far below, she could see the royal stables, the limestone roof she had scrubbed 1,000 times, the courtyard where she had first learned to walk, the small herb garden where Cicely grew remedies for sick horses. And there, on the high platform of the Eyrie, she could see Scald. The great crimson dragon was curled like a cat in the afternoon sun, his tail wrapped around his haunches. As if sensing her gaze, he lifted his head and looked directly at her window. That warm brush touched her mind again. Patient, waiting, certain. Do it, Ruby said. Cicely grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. Have you lost your senses? You'll die, girl. Maybe. Ruby's voice was steadier than she felt. But if I refuse, I go back to the stables in shame. Lady Giselle becomes Luna. Aldous gets what he wants. And every noble in the 5 valleys will say the dragon made a mistake. That Scald was wrong. She looked back out the window at the crimson beast watching her. He chose me, Ruby said softly. I don't know why, but I won't make a liar out of him. Cicely stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the old groom's weathered face broke into a fierce, proud smile. Then we've got 3 days until the festival, Cicely said. And I didn't raise a fool. If you're going to fly a war dragon, you're going to do it right. She turned to Ernest. Fetch every book on dragon flight from the royal library, and find Madeline. Tell her to bring her late husband's flight harness, the old one with the extra safety straps. Ernest nodded and hurried out, his illness momentarily forgotten in the face of purpose. Cicely grabbed Ruby's hands again, her grip like iron. Listen to me. Forget the gowns, forget the curtsies. Forget everything those powdered nobles want you to be. You're a stable girl, you know animals, you know their moods, their fears, their trust. That's your advantage. Lady Giselle tried to command Scald. You're going to listen to him. Ruby nodded, her heart pounding. Somewhere in the distance, Scald let out a low, rumbling call that echoed across the valley. It wasn't a roar of challenge. It was something softer, something that sounded almost like a promise. The first day, Ruby fell. Twice. They had moved her training to the lower pasture, far from the prying eyes of the court. Madeline had arrived with her late husband's flight harness, cracked leather and tarnished buckles that Ruby had to repair before she could even wear it. The extra safety straps were a grim reminder of why Madeline was a widow. Scald waited in the center of the field, patient as a mountain. Connor stood at the edge, arms crossed, golden eyes tracking every movement. He had not spoken since arriving. He simply watched. Mount, Cicely commanded. Ruby climbed into the saddle. The harness bit into her shoulders and thighs, connecting her to the saddle rings with thick leather tethers. She felt like a puppet on strings. Now lean forward and press your knees in, Madeline instructed, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had once loved a dragon rider and lost him. That tells him you're ready. Don't kick, don't shout, just ask. Ruby leaned forward. She pressed her knees against Scald's warm scales. She closed her eyes and tried to ask. Scald launched. The ground fell away so fast Ruby's stomach stayed behind. Wind screamed past her ears. The tethers snapped taut, slamming her back against the saddle. She grabbed the pommel with both hands, her knuckles white, her eyes squeezed shut. Too fast, too high, too fast. Scald banked hard left. Ruby didn't bank with him. The harness held her to the saddle, but her body swung wide, dangling over empty air. She screamed, and Scald leveled out. He glided in a slow, gentle circle, as if realizing his mistake. The frantic beating of his wings softened. Ruby forced her eyes open. The world below was a patchwork of green fields and gray stone. The wind was cold but clean. Then Scald dipped his shoulder again, and Ruby's grip slipped. She tumbled sideways, caught only by the safety straps, swinging beneath the dragon's belly like a pendulum. Connor was in the air before anyone could shout. His own flight harness was sleeker, darker, worn from years of use. He launched from the ground with a running leap that should have been impossible, catching a thermal current that carried him up to Scald's level. His hand closed around Ruby's wrist. Stop fighting him, Connor said, his voice calm despite the wind. He's not trying to throw you, he's trying to teach you. Feel his movements, move with him, not against him. Ruby stared at him, dangling over the void. I don't know how. Yes, you do. Connor pulled her upright, guiding her back into the saddle. His hand lingered on her shoulder. You've spent your whole life reading animals, reading their moods, their needs, their next moves. This is no different. Stop thinking, start feeling. He released her and dropped away, gliding back toward the ground on his dark harness wings. Ruby sat trembling in the saddle. Scald's great head turned, that molten eye finding hers. The warm brush touched her mind again, not impatient, just waiting. She closed her eyes. She stopped gripping the pommel. She let her thighs relax against his scales. She let her spine soften. Scald banked right. This time, Ruby banked with him. Her body leaned into the turn as naturally as breathing. The wind flowed around her instead of against her. When Scald leveled out, she was still centered in the saddle. The dragon let out a low, approving rumble. On the ground, Cicely grabbed Madeline's arm and squeezed the second day. They practiced commands. Not shouted orders like a general on a battlefield. Whispers. Ruby learned that Scald responded to pressure from her knees, to the shift of her weight, to the angle of her shoulders. A press of her left knee meant turn. A lean forward meant dive. Sitting tall and back meant climb. By midday, she could guide him through simple patterns in the sky. Circles, figure eights. Gentle descents that ended with Scald's massive talons touching the grass as softly as a sparrow landing on a branch. Connor watched from the ground, saying nothing. But when Ruby dismounted, trembling and exhilarated, she found a water skin and a plate of cold meat waiting for her. No one else had put them there the third day. Aldous came. The chamberlain appeared at the edge of the pasture as the sun began its descent, flanked by 2 guards in the midnight blue of the northern lord's house. Lady Giselle stood between them, her marble smile firmly back in place. Festival of Flames begins at sunset tomorrow, Aldous announced, his voice carrying across the field. The court will assemble, the people will gather, and the candidate will demonstrate the dragon's favor. He looked at Ruby with undisguised contempt. I trust you are prepared to prove your claim, girl, or to fall. Sicely stepped forward, her rough hands balling into fists. She's prepared. Now get off this field. You're spooking the beast. Scald, who had been dozing in the evening sun, opened one golden eye. A thin wisp of smoke curled from his nostril. Aldous took an involuntary step backward. This farce ends tomorrow, Giselle said. Her voice cold and sweet as poisoned honey. One way or another. She turned and swept away, Aldous and the guards trailing behind her. Ruby watched them go, her heart hammering. But when she turned back to Scald, the dragon was watching her with that patient, golden gaze. The warm brush against her mind felt stronger now, steadier, like a hand on her shoulder. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep. She stood at the tower window, watching the stars wheel overhead. A soft knock made her turn. Connor stood in the doorway. He wore a simple tunic, no crown, no sword, just the Alpha King stripped of ceremony. Afraid, he said. Yes. He stepped into the room, stopping a respectful distance away. Fear keeps you sharp, complacency kills riders. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. But it's the truth. I was afraid before my first solo flight, terrified. I vomited on Scald's scales before I mounted. Ruby stared at him. You're lying. I'm not. Cicely held my head while I heaved. She told me the same thing she probably told you, stop thinking, start feeling. Ruby looked back out the window. What if I fail tomorrow? What if I fall? Connor was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, looking out at the same stars. If you fall, he said quietly, Scald will catch you. He chose you, Ruby, not for your bloodline, not for your politics, for you. That kind of bond doesn't break because of a bad turn or a gust of wind. He turned to face her. In the starlight, his golden eyes seemed to glow. But you won't fall. You've spent 3 days learning what takes most riders 3 months. You listen to him. You move with him. Tomorrow, when you fly over the 5 valleys, every person watching will see what Scald saw the moment you fixed his saddle. What's that? Connor's hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Someone who belongs in the sky. He left without another word. Ruby stood frozen, her cheek still warm where his fingers had grazed her skin. Far below, Scald lifted his great head and looked up at her window. The warm brush in her mind felt like a hearth fire now. Steady. Certain. Home. Tomorrow she would fly or fall. But tonight, for the first time since she was a nameless foundling in a grain sack, Ruby felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The sun bled into the horizon as Ruby stood at the edge of the Royal Airy platform. Thousands of torches blazed across the volcanic caldera, transforming the mountain into a burning crown. The people of the 5 valleys had gathered in unprecedented numbers, their murmuring voices a constant tide against the stone. 4 days ago, she had hidden behind this very pillar. Now she wore a flight harness and faced the sky. Cicely's rough hands checked every buckle with fierce precision. You were the size of my 2 hands, the old groom muttered. Wrapped in a grain sack, I won't watch you die tonight. Come back, Ruby promised. Madeline pressed wax earplugs into her palm, her dead husband's. Ernest reported the stable hands had bet everything on her. Then the trumpets sounded, the royal procession entered. Aldous in midnight blue, Lord Varen's colors. The Council of 5. Lady Giselle in crimson that matched Scald's scales, her marble smile glittering with malice. Connor came last. No crown, just black leather and a great sword. His golden eyes found Ruby's and held. People of the 5 valleys, he called. My dragon rejected every noble candidate. He chose a girl who fixed his saddle. Tonight she flies. If she returns, she is Luna. If she falls, the choosing is void. The dragon decides, always. Ruby walked past Giselle's whispered venom, past Lord Varen's cold stare, past Aldous' contempt. She placed her hand on Scald's warm scales. Ready, ready. She mounted. Scald launched. The first seconds were terror. Then the world opened. The 5 valleys spread below like a map of moonlight and shadow. Ruby moved with Scald, not against him, banking when he banked, climbing when he climbed. Tears froze on her cheeks. She had never known freedom like this. Then Scald's wingbeat stuttered. Ruby felt it in her bones. A hitch, a weakness. She twisted in the saddle and saw the dark stain spreading through his crimson scales near the left wing joint. Blood. The wing membrane was swollen, tearing. Poison. Lady Giselle had walked past him on the platform. Crimson gown blending with crimson scales. Aldous and his eastern poisons. Scald's molten eye found hers, clouded with pain but steady with trust. Ruby leaned flat against his warm neck. We're going home together. Guided him with knees and weight. Bank right into a thermal current, level out, glide. Rest the injured wing. The airy torches grew closer. They came in hot and fast. The landing was hard. Scald stumbled, his injured wing buckling, but caught himself. They were down. Ruby slid from the saddle. Blood pooled beneath Scald's wing, but he was alive. "He's been poisoned," she shouted. Chaos erupted. Cicely sprinted forward, finding the dart caught in Scald's wing joint. Black obsidian nearly dissolved, but not fast enough. Connor was at Ruby's side. His voice was deadly quiet. "Who?" Ruby pointed at Giselle, Varen, Aldous. "All of them." Cell laughed coldly. "The creature is old." Perhaps carrying a peasant was too much. Connor had her against the pillar before she finished, his hand at her throat. "If my dragon dies, House Varen ends tonight." Scald growled, weak, pained, but still a war dragon's growl. The platform froze. Cicely held up the dart. "Obsidian, untraceable. Everyone knows Aldous sources from the Eastern apothecaries. Everyone knows he serves Lord Varen." Connor released Giselle. He took Ruby's hand and raised his voice. "Festival is over. The choosing is complete. Ruby flew my dragon injured and brought him home. She did not fall. She did not abandon him. She is my Luna. Any house that disputes this answers to me and to Scald." The crowd erupted, not cheers, but stomping. Thousands of feet pounding stone. The ancient signal of acceptance. Lord Varen's face went white. Giselle's smile shattered. Aldous dropped his staff as guards closed in. But Ruby only watched Scald. The dragon lowered his head, exhausted but alive. Cicely and the healer worked on his wing. The warm brush against Ruby's mind was faint now. But it was there. Quiet. Safe. Home. She squeezed Connor's hand and breathed. They had survived. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. 3 months had passed since the Festival of Flames, and Ruby still woke every morning expecting to smell hay and leather oil instead of lavender and hearth smoke. The Luna's chambers in the airy tower were obscenely large. 4 rooms, a sleeping chamber, a bathing room with heated water pumped from the volcanic springs, a sitting room with windows that faced the sunrise, and a small study lined with books she was slowly learning to read. The bed alone could have slept 6 stable hands comfortably. Silk sheets that whispered against her skin. Velvet curtains the color of aged wine. A fireplace that warmed the room without filling it with smoke, thanks to some clever dwarven engineering in the flue. She had spent her first weeks unable to sleep. The comfort was too strange, the silence too deep. She missed the sounds of the stables, the shifting of horses in their stalls, the distant rumble of Scald's sleeping breath echoing through the stone corridors, the familiar creak of old timber settling. She missed the smell of grain and leather and the particular sharpness of dragon scale polish. But she had learned to find new sounds. The wind against the tower stones, high and lonely. The soft breathing of the 2 attendants in the outer chamber, women she had finally stopped flinching at after the first month. And on the nights when Connor stayed, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beside her, his arm thrown across her waist like an anchor. Tonight, the bed was empty. He had risen before her, Ruby dressed alone in the gray pre-dawn light. She still refused most of the attendants' help, much to their dismay. They had been trained to dress noble ladies, to arrange hair and apply powders and cinch corsets. Ruby could cinch a saddle girth in 3 seconds flat, but she had no patience for ribbons. The former staff of Aldous, those who had not fled or been implicated in his schemes, whispered about her in the corridors. The feral Luna, the stable girl who won't wear silk, let them whisper. She had survived worse than gossip. She pulled on a simple wool tunic dyed deep blue, the Alpha's color, though she still felt like an imposter wearing it, and leather breeches that allowed movement. Old habits carved deep grooves. The fine gowns in her wardrobe hung like captured clouds, beautiful and useless, gathering dust. Cicely had laughed when she first saw them, running her rough fingers over the delicate embroidery. "Some things don't change," the old groom had said, her eyes bright with approval. "And shouldn't." Ruby paused at the small table by the door. 3 objects sat there, arranged with care. The iron buckle pin she had carried since her first day in the stables, its edge still faintly stained from the cut on her lip. Madeline's earplugs, the lamb's wool soft and worn. And a new addition, a small, smooth stone Scald had coughed up one morning and deposited at her feet like a gift. Dragon pearls, the healers called them, formed in the beast's crop from irritants swallowed over decades, worth a small fortune. Ruby kept it because it was warm to the touch, even when separated from Scald's body heat, her talismans, her anchors. She touched each one briefly, then slipped out into the corridor. The royal eyrie was quiet at this hour. The torches along the walls had burned low, their flames guttering in the pre-dawn breeze that swept through the open archways. Ruby walked the familiar path to the dragon platform, her soft boots silent on the worn volcanic stone. She passed 2 guards who nodded respectfully. She still wasn't used to that, and descended the final staircase. Skald was waiting. The great crimson dragon lay curled at the edge of the platform, his massive head resting on his crossed talons. The scar on his left wing joint had healed clean, thanks to Cicely's relentless care and the ancient healer's remedies. A silver line remained, cutting through the crimson scales like lightning frozen in stone. A reminder of poison and politics and how close they had come to falling. His molten eye opened as Ruby approached. The warm brush against her mind was stronger now than it had ever been, a hearth fire on a winter night, summer sun on bare skin, a mother's hand on a fevered brow. It had taken her weeks to understand that the warmth was Skald. Not words, not thoughts, just presence, acceptance. Something that felt terrifyingly like love. Home. Ruby sat beside his great head, her back against the warm scales of his neck. He smelled of sulfur and clean stone and something else, something she had come to recognize as dragon. It was a good smell. It smelled like belonging. They watched the horizon together in comfortable silence. The sun broke over the eastern peaks like molten gold spilling from a crucible. Light flooded the 5 valleys in waves. First the northern cliffs, their cold faces warming to amber. Then the eastern forests, their canopy waking with a riot of birdsong that Ruby could just hear from this height. The southern marshes glittered like scattered coins, their waterways reflecting the dawn. And the western plains stretched endless and free, a sea of green grass that rippled in the morning wind, mine, Ruby thought, not with possessiveness or pride, with wonder, with the slow, dawning weight of responsibility. These lands were hers to protect now. These people were hers to serve, not because of bloodline or birthright, but because Skald had chosen her and Connor had believed in that choice. Skald rumbled agreement, a vibration she felt in her spine. "You're up early." Connor's voice came from behind her. She didn't turn. She had felt him approach, not through magic or any mystical bond, but through the simple familiarity of his footsteps on stone, the particular rhythm of his breath, the way the air seemed to shift when he entered a space. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He wore no crown. He never did, except for formal ceremonies that made him scowl for hours afterward. Just a simple gray tunic, his golden eyes soft in the morning light, his dark hair still tousled from sleep. "Couldn't sleep," Ruby admitted. "Too much in my head." "That doesn't go away." Connor's voice was gentle, stripped of the command he wore like armor in public. "The weight of it, the wondering if you're enough. I've worn this crown for 12 years and I still wake up some nights convinced I'm failing everyone, that I've made the wrong choice, that the next dawn will bring a war I can't win." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My father used to say that a king who stops doubting himself is a king who has stopped paying attention. Doubt keeps you sharp. Complacency kills kingdoms." Ruby turned to look at him fully. In the 3 months since the festival, she had learned to read the subtleties of his face. The tightness around his eyes that meant political tension, the slight curl of his lip that meant he was suppressing a laugh, the way his jaw set when he was about to deliver bad news. This morning, he looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but something deeper, the bone weariness of a man who had been fighting alone for too long. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me?" Connor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "After my father died, the Council of 5 tried to marry me off to a northern princess. She was beautiful, educated, perfectly bred for the role. She arrived with a retinue of 100 servants and 12 wagons of dowry. She lasted 3 days. A ghost of dark humor touched his face. Skald wouldn't let her near the platform, wouldn't even look at her. The council was furious. Aldous. He stopped, the name still bitter on his tongue. Aldous said I should force the bond, that the dragon would accept her eventually if I commanded it. Ruby's hand found his. "You didn't." Connor turned his palm up, lacing his fingers through hers. "I told them I would rather rule alone than break my bondmates' trust. They called me a fool, a weak king." Lord Varen nearly convinced the council to invoke the succession clause. If I couldn't produce a Luna, they argued, perhaps I couldn't produce an heir. Perhaps the bloodline should be reconsidered. Ruby's grip tightened. She had known the politics were vicious. She hadn't known they had tried to remove him entirely. "I spent years watching noblewomen parade across this platform," Connor continued. "Dozens of them, each one more polished than the last. They wanted my crown, my power, my dragon. They wanted to be queen, not Luna. There's a difference. A Luna fights beside her alpha. A Luna carries the weight of the kingdom on her shoulders, not just on her head. He lifted their joined hands and pressed them to his chest, over his heart. Ruby felt its steady beat beneath her palm. You fixed his saddle. You didn't know anyone was watching. You just saw something broken and you fixed it. Then you flew him injured through the dark, guided him home with nothing but your knees and your instincts. You didn't fall. You didn't abandon him. You didn't abandon me. His voice cracked just slightly. I didn't know I was waiting for you, Ruby. But I was, every year, every failed choosing, every political scheme. I was waiting for the woman Scald would finally accept. And when he nudged you behind that pillar, I looked at your face, terrified, bloody-lipped, covered in ash, and I thought, there she is. Ruby's throat tightened until she could barely breathe. She had spent 15 years believing she was no one. A foundling wrapped in a grain sack, a shadow that scrubbed floors and mended leather, a pair of useful hands attached to a girl no one saw. She had never imagined being seen, being wanted, being loved. When you flew over the valleys that night, Connor said softly, I watched you disappear into the dark and I realized something. If you fell, I would burn the 5 valleys to the ground to find who caused it. That's not a king's thought. That's a man's thought. A man who had just found something he didn't know he needed. Ruby leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and certain. The kiss of a woman who had survived poison and politics and a flight through the dark, who had been invisible her whole life and was finally seen. Her hands fisted in his tunic. Connor's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing the faint scar on her lower lip, the cut from the buckle pin, healed now but permanent, and he kissed her back like she was the only solid thing in a world of shifting shadows. When they broke apart, Scald let out a low, rumbling purr. The sound vibrated through the stone beneath them and up into their bones. I think he approves, Ruby whispered against Connor's lips. He's been insufferably smug since the day he nudged you, Connor said dryly, though his eyes were bright. Won't let me near the saddle without checking if you're coming too. Knocked me on my backside last week when I tried to fly solo to the eastern border. Ruby laughed. The sound echoed across the platform and out over the valley, bright and free. He did not. Absolutely did. Cicely watched the whole thing. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. Ruby could picture it perfectly. Connor sprawled on the stone, indignant and dusty, while Scald loomed over him with that smug gleam in his molten eye. The image was so absurd. So normal that she laughed again, harder this time. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. This was her life now. This impossible, wonderful, terrifying life the sun was fully up, bathing the 5 valleys in gold. Ruby could hear the stir of life below, the stable hands beginning their morning rounds, their voices carrying up from the lower courtyards. The kitchen fires being lit, thin trails of smoke rising from the chimneys. The guards changing shifts, their boots rhythmic on the walls. A distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, her people. Her home. Cicely appeared at the edge of the platform, her weathered face creased with a knowing smile that suggested she had been watching for some time and waiting for the right moment to interrupt. Knew I'd find you here, she said, her rough voice warm. Ernest is looking for you, Ruby. Something about the new batch of saddle leather from the southern tanners. Says it's too stiff, won't take the oil properly. He wants your opinion before he rejects the whole shipment. Ruby stood, brushing stone dust from her breeches. Tell him I'll be down after breakfast. Cicely nodded, but she didn't leave. Her sharp eyes moved from Ruby to Connor to Scald, and her smile deepened into something softer, almost maternal. 15 years, she said quietly. 15 years since I found you in that grain sack near the sluice gates. You were so small I could hold you in 2 hands, blue with cold. I thought you were dead until you opened your eyes and looked at me. Ruby's heart clenched. Cicely rarely spoke of that night. I took you to the stables because it was warm, the old groom continued. I thought I'd keep you alive through the winter, then find you a place in the village. But you kept surviving, kept growing, kept watching everything with those big, quiet eyes. By the time you were 5, you could name every horse in the stalls by their hoofbeats. By 10, you could mend leather better than Ernest. By 15, she trailed off, her voice rough. By 15, you were the heart of those stables, and you didn't even know it. The other hands looked to you. The animals trusted you. Even Scald watched you when you weren't looking. I saw it. I always saw it. Ruby crossed to the old groom and pulled her into a fierce embrace. Cicely smelled of hay and leather oil and the particular sharpness of dragon scale polish, the smell of home. the smell of the woman who had chosen to save a dying foundling when no one else would. "I'm still the girl who fixes buckles," Ruby whispered into Cicely's gray hair. "That won't change, no matter how many silk gowns they hang in my wardrobe." Cicely's rough hands gripped her back just as fiercely. "Good, don't you dare let it. A Luna who forgets where she came from is a Luna who loses herself. I've seen it happen to nobles born in palaces. It'll happen faster to you if you're not careful." She pulled away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a brusque, businesslike motion. "Now. Breakfast, then leather. Then you've got a meeting with a Western Trade Lord's representative at midday. Something about grain shipments, and don't think I don't know you've been skipping your reading lessons." Ruby winced. "The tutor smells like old cheese." "The tutor is the finest scholar in the 5 Valleys, and he smells like aged cheese. There's a difference." Cicely's eyes glinted with humor. "Go on, then. Your alpha's probably hungry too, though he's too polite to say so." She shuffled off toward the stables, her uneven gait, the result of a horse kicked 20 years ago, familiar and beloved. Connor came to stand beside Ruby, his shoulder brushing hers. "She's terrifying." "Raised me. That explains a great deal." Ruby elbowed him in the ribs. He grunted, but he was smiling. They didn't go to breakfast immediately. Scald rose behind them, his great wings stretching wide. The morning light caught the crimson membranes, turning them to living flame. The scar on his left wing joint gleamed silver. He shook himself like a massive dog, then fixed Ruby with that molten eye. The warm brush against her mind carried a single, clear feeling. "Fly." Ruby looked at Connor. He raised an eyebrow, the invitation clear. She swung up into the saddle in a single fluid motion, a far cry from the awkward scramble of her first mount. The leather was warm from Scald's body heat. The cinch buckle she had repaired 3 months ago held firm and true, the leather molded perfectly to the dragon's girth. She reached down and offered Connor her hand. "Coming, Alpha King." He took it, his grip warm and sure. He swung up behind her with the ease of long practice, his arms wrapping around her waist. His chest was solid against her back. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. Scald launched. The platform fell away. The 5 valleys spread beneath them, golden and green and endless, stitched together by the silver ribbon of the great river. The wind sang past Ruby's ears, but she no longer needed Madeline's earplugs. She had learned to hear herself in the roar. She had learned to trust her own instincts, her own balance, her own connection to the beast beneath her. She leaned into the turn as Scald banked toward the rising sun. Connor's arms tightened around her. The dragon's purr vibrated through her bones, through the saddle, through the very air. Below, she could see the stables, small from this height but unmistakable. The limestone roof she had scrubbed 1,000 times. The courtyard where she had first learned to walk. The small herb garden where Cicely grew remedies for sick horses. The lower pasture where she had trained for 3 desperate days, falling and rising and falling again until she learned to fly. Home, she thought, all of it. Home. Scald caught a thermal current and rose higher. The air thinned and cooled. The world became abstract, patterns of light and shadow, the curve of the horizon, the distant gleam of the northern peaks. And Ruby felt that familiar, impossible feeling rise in her chest. Freedom. She was no longer a foundling, no longer a shadow, no longer invisible. She was no longer the girl who fixed buckles and hoped no one noticed her. She was Ruby of the royal stables, Luna of the 5 valleys, rider of the war dragon, beloved of the Alpha King, and she was exactly where she belonged. Scald roared, not a challenge, not a warning, but a cry of pure, savage joy that echoed across the valleys and up into the endless sky. Ruby threw her head back and laughed, the sound swallowed by the wind. Behind her, Connor pressed a kiss to her hair and held on. If you enjoy reading this story, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.